Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat, and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like and share, and tell us in the comments. Do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The sun burned low across the horizon, staining the wide Texas plains in gold and blood-red light. The land was vast, silent, and merciless, stretching farther than a man's eyes could see. It was the kind of place where men came to disappear, and others came to be reborn. Ethan Cole had lived on this land for 10 years. Once a drifter, now a rancher, he had carved his life from dust and sweat. His small ranch sat on the edge of the Pecos Creek, a winding ribbon of cool water that brought life to his cattle and solitude to his soul. He was a man of few words and fewer friends. The wide sky and the hum of the wind were his constant companions. But that day, something changed. The morning had started like any other. Ethan was mending a broken fence line when he heard something unusual. A faint splash carried on the wind. The sound came from the creek behind his property, a place where he often watered his horse but rarely lingered. It was too quiet, too far from the ranch house for ordinary visitors. He set down his tools and moved quietly, his boots pressing soft against the grass. Years of living alone had sharpened his instincts. Every rustle, every gust told him something. And what he heard now wasn't the movement of deer or cattle. It was deliberate, careful, human. As he drew near, he saw her. At first he thought it was a mirage, the kind the desert plays on tired eyes. But the vision didn't fade. In the shallow bend of the creek, a woman bathed in the clear water, her long black hair glinting under the sun. Her skin carried the bronze hue of the Apache, her movements both graceful and cautious, as if she feared the land itself might turn against her. Ethan froze. He had seen Apache women before, but none like her. There was something about the way the light kissed her features, the quiet strength in her stance, that rooted him to the ground. She was beauty in its rawest, most untamed form, wild as the land that bore her. Then he noticed something else, the torn edges of her dress, the bruises along her arms, the way her eyes darted toward every sound, even the cry of a distant hawk. This was no ordinary woman bathing in peace. This was someone running, from something or someone. The thought made his pulse quicken. The frontier was no place for an unprotected woman, especially not an Apache fugitive. The U.S. cavalry patrols rode often through these parts, and the mere sight of her could mean capture. Or worse. Ethan stepped back, careful not to make a sound. He knew the stories of settlers who had interfered in the affairs of fugitives, and the punishments that followed. Still, a part of him couldn't leave her there. Something deep inside him, buried beneath years of silence, stirred compassion, or perhaps fate. He returned to his ranch quietly, but the image of the woman in the water haunted him. As night fell, he sat by the fire, staring into the flames, seeing her face reflected in every flicker. Who was she? Why had she come to his land? The next morning, he couldn't help himself. He saddled his horse and rode back to the creek. The air was still cool from the dawn, the mist rising off the water like ghostly breath. But she was gone. Only footprints remained, small, light impressions along the bank, leading toward the hills beyond his property. Ethan dismounted, crouched low, and touched the prints. They were fresh. She hadn't gone far. Something inside him whispered that their paths would cross again. That evening he heard it, the soft neigh of a frightened horse somewhere near his corral. He rushed outside, rifle in hand, and there she was, standing at the edge of his property, shivering, her eyes wide and wild, the same Apache woman from the creek. But before he could move, a distant sound reached them both, the echo of hooves, many of them, pounding the dry earth. Soldiers. A patrol was closing in fast. Ethan's heart thudded. The woman looked toward the sound, then back at him. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and though no words were spoken, he understood everything. She was a fugitive, yes, but not a criminal. She was a soul hunted unjustly, and this might be her last chance to live. He made his decision in silence. The story of Ethan Cole and the mysterious Apache beauty had begun, not with a word, but with a choice, a choice that would soon change both their lives forever. The soldiers were coming, the land held its breath, and the creek behind the ranch would never be the same again. The soldiers' hoofbeats thundered through the valley, echoing off the dry canyon walls like distant thunder. Dust rose in thick clouds, carried by the wind, as the patrol advanced across the plains. The land was vast, but sound traveled far in that empty silence. Ethan Cole stood frozen in the doorway of his barn, his rifle lowered, his breath steady but tense. Before him, barely visible under the pale glow of the moon, stood the Apache woman he had seen bathing in the creek. Her dark hair clung to her face, tangled from wind and fear. Her clothes were torn, her feet bare, and her eyes, those deep, haunting eyes, spoke of exhaustion, hunger, and desperation. She was a fugitive. That much was clear now. But what crime could such a fragile soul have committed to be hunted through the wilderness like an animal? Ethan didn't know, and he didn't care. Something within him stirred stronger than reason or fear. The sound of hooves was growing louder. He didn't have time to think. He gestured toward the back of his property, where the land sloped into the canyon, a rugged stretch of rock and brush that hid a small hunting cabin he'd built years ago. It wasn't much, just 4 wooden walls, a cot, and a stone hearth. But it was secluded, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The woman hesitated for a heartbeat, then vanished into the darkness, moving like a shadow. Ethan watched her go, his mind a storm of conflict. Helping her could cost him everything, his ranch, his freedom, even his life. Yet as the soldiers' torches flickered in the distance, something in his heart whispered that some things were worth the risk. The patrol arrived moments later, a dozen men in dust-streaked uniforms, rifles gleaming under the lantern light. Their leader, a hard-faced sergeant, questioned Ethan, his voice sharp and commanding. Ethan said little, his calmness betraying nothing. They searched the area briefly, their boots trampling through the creekside brush, but found no trace of the fugitive. The night swallowed her completely. When they finally rode off, Ethan stood alone beneath the moon, the cool air thick with tension. The land returned to silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through dry grass. He exhaled slowly and turned toward the canyon. The path to the hidden cabin was steep and narrow, winding between jagged cliffs and thorny scrub. The stars hung low overhead, and the cry of a nighthawk followed him as he made his way down. When he reached the cabin, he found her there, crouched in the shadows, trembling beside the door. Ethan's eyes softened. She looked even smaller now, fragile as a ghost, yet there was a quiet strength about her, a spark of defiance that refused to fade. She had survived somehow, against a world that wished her gone. He left her water and a blanket, then stepped outside, keeping watch from a distance. The desert was cold at night. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind carried whispers of things long dead. But Ethan didn't sleep. He sat beside the dying embers of his lantern, listening to the heartbeat of the wild, and thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. Morning came with a thin veil of mist rising from the canyon floor. The woman emerged from the cabin, cautious but calmer. The first rays of sunlight revealed faint scars along her wrists and a long healed wound on her shoulder. She had clearly endured more than most could bear. Ethan gathered supplies, bread, dried meat, a canteen, and left them by the door before returning to the ranch. He told himself it was the right thing to do, nothing more. Yet all that day his thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin. He imagined her sitting by the fire, her face lit by the flames, her eyes reflecting memories of another world, one torn by war, loss, and the struggle to survive. Days passed in uneasy rhythm. He worked his cattle, repaired fences, and kept to himself. But each evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, he would make the long walk to the canyon, carrying food and supplies. Each time, she was there, watching him silently, wary but no longer afraid. Though no words were spoken, a fragile trust began to form between them, as quiet and delicate as the breeze that swept through the mesquite trees. Ethan could see her beginning to recover. Her strength returned. Her eyes no longer darted at every sound. Sometimes she would stand by the creek near the cabin, letting the wind tangle her hair, her gaze fixed toward the horizon. It was then that Ethan began to wonder who she truly was. He'd heard stories, of Apache women who escaped capture, of tribes pushed from their lands, of raids gone wrong. But something about her seemed different. There was grace in her movements, pride in the way she carried herself, and sorrow in her silence. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Ethan noticed smoke far to the east, a signal fire perhaps, or a camp. His gut twisted. The soldiers were still searching. If they found her, there would be no mercy. That night, he didn't sleep. He stayed by the cabin, rifle in hand, keeping watch. The wilderness was alive with unseen danger, the crack of twigs, the whisper of footsteps, the low growl of wolves in the distance. He knew the risk he was taking. If the army discovered he'd harbored a fugitive Apache, it wouldn't matter that she was unarmed or starving. They would call it treason. But Ethan had made his choice long ago. The moment he first saw her in the creek, the world could judge him how it pleased. The following morning, the woman stepped from the cabin and looked at him for a long moment. The canyon wind lifted her hair, and the sunlight caught the faint traces of a smile. It was small, fleeting, but it was the first time he had seen warmth in her expression. Ethan turned away, feeling something stir deep within. A strange, quiet comfort. The silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like peace. But peace in the Wild West never lasted long. By midday, smoke rose again, closer this time. Ethan climbed the ridge above the canyon and saw movement along the horizon. Soldiers, dozens of them. They were sweeping the area, their path leading straight toward his land. The stillness of the morning shattered. He had little time. The woman's secret refuge was about to be discovered. Ethan descended the ridge, his heart pounding. The dry wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves. He knew the soldiers wouldn't stop until they searched every inch of land. He reached the cabin door and looked toward the horizon once more. The decision he faced now would test the very core of who he was. A simple rancher caught between loyalty to law and the unspoken bond he had found with the fugitive woman he barely knew. The storm was coming. The world around them was shifting. And deep inside, Ethan understood. Whatever destiny awaited them both, there was no turning back now. The sky had darkened long before sunset. Heavy clouds rolled in from the west, turning the plains into a gray expanse of restless wind and rising dust. The land seemed to hold its breath, as if it too sensed the danger closing in. Ethan Cole stood at the mouth of the canyon, watching the horizon. The faint outlines of riders appeared in the distance, soldiers on patrol, their formations spreading wide like a tightening noose. They were coming closer, methodical and merciless. The fugitive's hiding place would soon be discovered. He turned toward the hidden cabin. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney, and the woman within waited in tense silence. She'd become a ghost in his life, a living secret, known only to the wind and the stones. For days, Ethan had protected her. But the weight of that choice now pressed heavy on his chest. The storm above broke with sudden fury. Lightning cracked across the sky, splitting the horizon in flashes of silver. Thunder rolled down the canyons, echoing like cannon fire. Sheets of rain poured down, soaking the dry earth, turning dust into mud and trails into rivers. The soldiers pressed on, their torches flickering and fading against the tempest. Ethan knew this storm was both a curse and a gift. It would make the soldiers advance slower, but it also erased any tracks, including those that could help him navigate. Still, he had no choice. If she stayed, she would be caught. If they ran now, there was a chance, a small, desperate chance, to reach the mountains before dawn. He saddled his horse under the pounding rain, his hands trembling from the cold. The woman emerged from the cabin, her long hair plastered to her face, her dark eyes filled with fear and determination. She carried nothing but a worn blanket around her shoulders. Despite her exhaustion, she stood tall, a silent emblem of courage against a world that had turned against her. Ethan mounted and extended a hand. She hesitated, then climbed behind him, her arms barely steady as she gripped the saddle. With a sharp tug of the reins, he urged the horse forward, and together they vanished into the storm. The ride through the canyon was treacherous. Rainwater poured down the rocky slopes, forming rushing streams that carved through the path. The horse slipped more than once, and the cold wind bit into their faces like knives. Yet Ethan pressed on. guiding them through the narrow pass that only he knew. Every turn, every ridge, every jagged rock was etched in his memory. The land itself had been his only companion for years, and now it served as his ally once more. Lightning illuminated the plains beyond. The soldiers' torches glowed faintly in the distance, moving like a swarm of fireflies, scattered but persistent. Ethan knew they would not stop until they found her. They had orders, and in the eyes of the army, an Apache fugitive was worth more dead than alive. The woman clung to him, silent, her heart beating against his back in rhythm with the pounding rain. In that endless storm their fates were bound, not by words or promises, but by sheer survival. Hours passed. The storm grew worse. Thunder crashed so close it shook the ground beneath them. The horse began to tire, its breaths heavy and uneven. Ethan guided them toward a rocky outcrop, a small overhang that offered some shelter from the rain. They dismounted and took cover beneath it. The world outside was chaos. Wind howling, rain lashing the earth, flashes of light tearing open the darkness. Ethan's body trembled with fatigue, but his mind stayed sharp. The soldiers would not travel far in such weather, yet the storm would not last forever. Once the skies cleared, the hunt would begin again. The woman sat beside him, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes distant. She seemed to listen to the storm as if it were speaking in a language only she could understand. The voice of nature, raw and untamed, as wild as the blood that ran through her veins. As the night dragged on, the storm began to weaken, the rain softened to a steady drizzle, and the first stars began to pierce through the thinning clouds. Ethan looked toward the horizon, a faint line of gray marking the coming dawn. The worst had passed, but danger still loomed. They couldn't stay there. The soldiers would resume their search at sunrise. He had to find a place they couldn't be tracked, somewhere deep enough that even the army's scouts wouldn't follow. There was one such place, a hidden trail leading through the Red Mesa cliffs, a narrow route once used by trappers and outlaws to cross into Apache territory. Few dared to go there now. The path was steep, the terrain brutal, and the legends around it spoke of spirits that guarded the dead. But to Ethan, superstition was a small price to pay for freedom. When the first light of morning touched the plains, he helped the woman back onto the horse. The air was cold and heavy with the scent of wet earth. They rode north, leaving behind the flooded canyon, moving deeper into the wilderness. The storm had washed away all tracks, a blessing that bought them precious time. But the soldiers, relentless as ever, would soon find their trail again. As they rode, the land began to change. The grassy plains gave way to rocky ridges, and the soil turned red beneath their feet. The wind carried the cries of distant hawks, and the vast emptiness of the desert stretched before them. Ethan knew they were close to the edge of known land. Beyond this, there were no maps, no laws, only the wild domain of the Apache tribes. He wondered if she sought to return to her people, or if her home had already been lost to the violence that consumed so many. Her silence gave no answer. She sat behind him, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if drawn toward something he could not see. The sun rose higher, burning through the mist. The world glistened in the aftermath of the storm, every blade of grass, every rock shimmering with light. It was beautiful, but it was also a cruel reminder that beauty often came after ruin. Ethan slowed his horse near a ridge and paused. Far below, the open valley stretched endlessly, dotted with mesas and sparse brush. It was vast, silent, and alive with secrets. Somewhere in that endless expanse, safety might await. But before he could move again, a faint sound reached his ears, the sharp echo of gunfire, distant but unmistakable. The soldiers were closer than he thought. The chase was far from over. He urged the horse forward, pushing them down the narrow trail that led toward the cliffs. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of rain and gunpowder. The woman held tighter, her grip firm, her heartbeat steady. They rode into the rising sun, two figures against the boundless wild, hunted by men, pursued by fate, and carried onward by something neither could name. Behind them, the storm clouds still lingered, heavy and dark, rolling over the plains like a warning. Ahead, the mountains waited, ancient, silent, and unforgiving. Ethan knew the hardest part was yet to come, The Red Mesa was no place for the faint of heart, but it was the only path left, and as they disappeared into the wilderness, the sound of the soldiers' pursuit faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of wind through stone and the steady beat of hooves echoing into the unknown. The Red Mesa rose before them like a fortress of stone, carved by time and shadow. Its cliffs glowed crimson under the rising sun, vast and ancient, a monument to both beauty and danger. Few men dared to cross it. The narrow trails wound through sharp ridges and sudden drops where a single misstep could send horse and rider tumbling into endless silence. For Ethan Cole, it was their last refuge. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew faint, but it was not gone. The soldiers would not turn back. They were relentless men, trained to follow orders until their quarry was either captured or buried beneath the dust. The Apache woman rode behind him, silent as always, her eyes scanning the land with wary understanding. This was no longer foreign ground to her. The deeper they rode into the mesas, the more the wilderness seemed to welcome her presence. To Ethan, it was hostile terrain, jagged, dry, and deceptive, but to her, it was something else. It was memory. They followed a trail that twisted through high walls of red stone, where the wind whispered through narrow cracks like the voices of spirits. The air was dry again, heavy with heat. Their horses' hooves struck sparks on the hard rock, echoing like distant gunfire. By midday, they reached a plateau overlooking a shallow valley below. A ribbon of green cut through the barren land, a creek, faint but alive. They stopped to rest, both exhausted from the days of running. Ethan let the horse drink while the woman knelt by the water's edge, her fingers trailing through it as though touching something sacred. The land stretched endlessly before them, wild and unforgiving. Yet in that harsh emptiness, there was a quiet peace. Ethan realized he hadn't felt that kind of stillness in years, not since before the war, before the loneliness of ranch life had hollowed out his soul. The woman turned her gaze toward the horizon, where distant peaks shimmered in the heat. She seemed to know the way forward, though Ethan could not tell what destination lay beyond. Perhaps it was the land of her people, or perhaps just another place to hide. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. As the afternoon wore on, dark clouds began to gather again in the west, smaller this time, but heavy with rain. The sky turned the color of rust, and thunder rumbled low against the mesas. The weather in these lands changed without warning, and Ethan knew what that meant. Flash floods. The dry gullies could fill within minutes, swallowing anything in their path. They moved quickly, descending from the plateau into a maze of narrow canyons, their walls rising high above them. The sound of distant thunder grew louder, and the air grew thick with the scent of rain and stone. The first drops began to fall, tapping softly against the rock. Then, without warning, the heavens opened. Rain poured in torrents, cascading down the canyon walls in silver streams. The creek they had crossed, only hours before, swelled into a raging river. The horse struggled to find footing as the water surged around its legs. Ethan guided them toward higher ground, but the path was slippery, the current strong. The roar of rushing water filled his ears, drowning out every other sound. At one point the horse stumbled, nearly throwing them both into the torrent. Ethan clung to the saddle, his heart pounding as he forced the animal forward. The woman's grip tightened behind him, her strength steady despite the chaos around them. Somehow they made it to a rocky ledge where the water could not reach. They waited there for hours as the flood raged below, trapped between walls of red stone and sky. When the storm finally began to ease, the land lay transformed. Streams where there had been dust, silence where there had been thunder. The setting sun broke through the clouds, painting the mesa in fiery light. It was a sight both terrible and beautiful. As night fell, they built a small fire in the shelter of an overhang. Ethan watched the flames dance in the reflection of her eyes. She sat across from him, still and thoughtful, her features half lit by the glow. The rain had washed away the dirt from their journey, leaving her face clear, untouched, a living portrait of strength carved by survival. He found himself wondering again who she truly was before the world turned against her. What had driven her to flee? What pain had chased her across the plains and rivers, through the hands of soldiers and into the arms of wilderness? There were no answers in her silence, yet somehow he understood. They were both exiles in their own ways. Him from peace, her from home. The night deepened, coyotes called in the distance, and the stars emerged one by one above the cliffs. The desert was alive again, breathing under the cool air. Ethan dozed beside the fire, his body heavy with exhaustion, his mind filled with fragments of memory. The first time he saw her in the creek, the fear in her eyes, the strength in her silence. Sometime in the night, he woke to find her standing near the edge of the ledge, her face turned toward the valley below. The moonlight bathed her in silver, and for a fleeting moment she looked like a spirit risen from the earth itself. He stayed still, watching as she raised her hand toward the distant peaks, a gesture of longing or perhaps farewell. Then she turned back, her eyes calm, and sat beside the fire once more. By morning, the floodwaters had receded. The air was clear, and the land shimmered with dew. They rode again, following the canyon deeper into the heart of the mesas. The trail was narrow but firm now, leading upward toward the mountains. As they climbed higher, the signs of pursuit grew faint. For the first time there were no hoofprints, no smoke on the horizon. It seemed the soldiers had finally turned back, defeated by the storm and the endless maze of rock. Ethan felt relief wash through him, but it was laced with uncertainty. Freedom was close, yet it carried its own burden. What would happen when they reached her land? Would she leave him behind, vanish back into the wild from which she came? The thought lingered like a shadow, unspoken but heavy. As the sun dipped low once more, they reached a narrow ridge overlooking a vast valley, green and alive, unlike the barren lands behind them. The sight stole his breath. It was the border of Apache territory, untouched and sacred, protected by the very wildness that had nearly killed them. The woman dismounted slowly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. For the first time, there was something new in her expression, not fear, not pain, but peace. She had come home, Ethan realized, in that moment, that the journey that had begun as an act of mercy had turned into something far greater. The silence they shared had become its own language, spoken through sacrifice, through the storms and dangers they faced together. But peace in the Wild West was never more than borrowed time. As he stood there beside her, the sound of distant hooves reached his ears once again, faint but real. The soldiers had found their trail after all. The woman turned sharply, her face pale against the light of dusk. Ethan's hand went to his rifle, his heart steady but heavy. The calm they had found atop the red mesa was about to shatter. And as the echoes of pursuit grew louder, the world seemed to hold its breath once more. The time for running was over. The valley lay before them, bathed in the golden haze of late afternoon. It was a vast sweep of wilderness, where the green of the earth met the red of the mesas, where wildflowers trembled in the wind, and the scent of rain lingered from the storm that had passed. It might have been paradise, but to Ethan Cole and the woman beside him, it was the edge of the world, and the end of running. For days they had crossed the mesas, surviving on little more than courage and will. Now, as the valley stretched beneath them, it felt as though the land itself whispered a promise of rest. The woman's dark eyes softened as she looked across it. This was her world, the last fragment of her people's home, untamed, unbroken, and sacred. Ethan could see it in her gaze, a quiet recognition, a sense of belonging he had never known. Yet even in that moment of peace, the past still followed. Somewhere behind them, faint and distant, came the echo of hooves. The soldiers were not far. The descent into the valley was steep, and the path narrow. Loose stones rolled under their horses' hooves, and the wind whistled through the cliffs like the mournful cry of spirits long forgotten. Ethan led carefully, every sense sharpened. He knew that one misstep, one careless noise, could draw death upon them both. By the time they reached the valley floor, the light had dimmed. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the world grew quiet in that strange, heavy way it did before nightfall. They found shelter near a grove of cottonwoods, beside a small pool of water, the surface reflecting the last glimmer of the setting sun. Ethan dismounted and looked around. The land here was untouched. No footprints, no trails, no signs of men. It was a place time had forgotten. For a fleeting moment he allowed himself to believe they were safe. The woman knelt by the pool, her reflection rippling in the fading light. She dipped her hands into the water, then lifted them to her face, as though cleansing herself of all that had come before. The gesture was simple, but in it there was a kind of reverence, a return to something pure, something lost. Ethan watched her quietly, feeling a strange calm settle over him. The long days of fear and exhaustion had dulled his mind, but now, surrounded by this untouched beauty, he felt the weight lift, if only slightly. The danger was still near, but for the first time he didn't think of running. That night, they built a small fire. The flames flickered low, casting soft light against the trunks of the cottonwoods. The wind rustled gently through the leaves, and far in the distance, a wolf howled, not in threat, but as a song to the lonely land. Ethan sat near the fire, his rifle beside him, keeping watch as he always did. The woman rested not far away, her head bowed, her body still, but her presence felt like a quiet force beside him. Silent, steady, unbroken, the bond between them had deepened in ways words could never describe. In the stillness, their silence spoke of everything, of gratitude, of trust, of something fragile yet powerful blooming between two lives once torn apart by the world's cruelty. But peace, as always, was short-lived. Just before dawn, Ethan woke to the faint crack of a twig. His instincts, honed by years of solitude, stirred instantly. The fire had burned down to embers. The valley was wrapped in a dim gray mist, and through it, movement, a shape shifting between trees, then another. He reached for his rifle. The horse neighed softly, uneasy. Then came the unmistakable sound of metal, the rattle of spurs, the creak of saddles. The soldiers had found them. They must have followed the trail through the canyon, relentless even after days of pursuit. Perhaps it was luck, or perhaps fate, but now they were here, closing in like wolves scenting blood. Ethan's heart pounded, but his thoughts were clear. The woman stirred beside him, her eyes wide with sudden awareness. The fear that crossed her face was fleeting. In its place came calm, a fierce, unspoken courage. He motioned toward the far end of the grove, where the land dipped into a series of low ravines. It was their only chance. The maze-like gullies could hide them if they moved fast. They slipped into the mist, leaving the dying fire behind. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth. Behind them, the soldiers spread through the trees, their boots crunching softly, rifles ready, voices carried faintly through the fog, harsh and commanding. Ethan led her down into the ravine, every step a test of silence. The ground was slick with mud from the earlier storm, and the walls of the gully loomed high on either side. The sound of water trickled faintly somewhere below, hidden in the depths. For a while it seemed they might have escaped notice. The soldiers' voices faded, swallowed by distance and fog. But then a shout, sharp and angry, cut through the air. A rifle fired, the shot echoing across the valley. A bullet struck the rocks near Ethan's feet, sending splinters of stone flying. They ran, the ravine twisted left, then right, the terrain uneven and treacherous. The woman stumbled once, but Ethan caught her arm, steadying her. The echo of gunfire followed, closer now, the soldiers giving chase. At last the ravine opened into a wide clearing bordered by cliffs. The sun was rising, pale and cold. Ethan looked around, realizing too late that they had reached a dead end. There was nowhere left to go. The woman turned to face him. Her dark eyes held no fear, only resolve. She seemed to understand what was coming. Perhaps she had always known. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle. His breath came slow and steady. The sound of hooves grew louder, and soon shapes emerged through the mist. Men on horseback, rifles gleaming, their faces grim. They surrounded the clearing, cutting off every escape. For a long moment, the world was silent, save for the restless snorts of the horses and the whisper of wind through the canyon. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the valley. And then, chaos. Gunfire erupted, shattering the silence. Ethan moved like instinct, firing, ducking behind rocks, the air thick with smoke and dust. The horse screamed and bolted. The woman crouched low, her hand clutching the blanket around her shoulders. The soldiers pressed closer, their shouts echoing across the cliffs. Time blurred, seconds stretching into eternity. Ethan's heart thundered as he fought to hold them off, one man against many, driven not by rage but by something far stronger, the will to protect. But numbers and fate were cruel. A shot rang out from the ridge, sharp and final. Ethan felt the impact, a burst of heat, then cold, and the world tilted. He fell to one knee, his vision dimming. Through the haze he saw her, the Apache woman, standing tall amid the chaos, her eyes burning with fury and grief. She turned toward the soldiers, her face fierce in the morning light, and for a heartbeat, time itself seemed to stop. Ethan's last sight before darkness claimed him was her figure, radiant against the rising sun, defiant as the land itself. Then, everything faded into silence. The valley held its breath once more. Morning light crept slowly across the valley, painting the cliffs in hues of gold and crimson. The echoes of gunfire had long since faded, leaving behind a silence so deep it seemed sacred. Smoke drifted lazily in the air, rising from the burned remnants of brush and broken saddles. The land had gone still again, but it was not the stillness of peace. It was the stillness that comes after loss. For a time the world seemed to hold its breath. When the soldiers finally rode away, they left behind more than footprints and ashes. They left behind a story, one that the wind would carry, whispered across the canyons for years to come. In the center of the clearing lay Ethan Cole, the rancher who had defied both law and fear for something he barely understood but could never deny. His rifle was still in his grasp, the barrel cool now, and his hat had fallen to the dust beside him, but death had not claimed him fully. His breath still came shallow and broken. The world swayed in and out of shadow. Through the haze he felt the faint touch of cool fingers against his brow. When his eyes fluttered open, he saw her, the Apache woman, kneeling beside him, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her long dark hair tangled with dust and blood. She had survived. Around them, the valley lay silent, but she was not alone. The earth seemed to move with her. The whispering grass, the trembling leaves, even the creek nearby, all seemed to echo her grief. Her gaze lingered on the rancher's face, seeing not the enemy her people had warned her about, but the man who had risked everything to give her a chance at life. She tore a strip from her blanket and pressed it against the wound on his side. There was no panic in her movement, only quiet determination, but in her heart she knew some wounds could not be healed by hand or hope. Time blurred, the sun rose higher and the air grew warm. The sounds of birds slowly returned, cautious at first, then steady. Ethan's breathing grew fainter. His eyes, once bright with resolve, now softened as they found her face again. Though no words passed between them, there was understanding. A silent farewell written in the space between their souls. She stayed with him until his breathing stopped. When the final sigh escaped his lips, she did not cry out. She simply closed his eyes and rested her hand upon his chest, feeling the last echo of his heartbeat fade beneath her palm. The world grew quiet once more. Then, gently, she rose. By the creek she gathered stones, smooth white ones shaped by water and time. One by one she placed them over his resting place, building a small cairn. The act was slow, deliberate, sacred. In her people's way it was a promise, that the spirit would not wander, that the soul would be remembered. The wind rose softly, carrying the scent of wild sage across the valley, as though blessing the ground where he lay. When the cairn was finished, she stood for a long time, gazing at the creek that had first bound their fates together. She could still see it clearly. That first morning when he had found her there, the fugitive bathing beneath the dawn light, her reflection rippling like a dream across the water. So much had changed since then. The man who once watched from the shadows now rested beneath this earth, and she who had once run from all men now carried his memory in her heart. She turned her face to the wind and began to walk. Days passed as she moved through the wilderness, crossing rivers, climbing canyons, following the silent paths known only to her people. She carried no weapon, no food, only the strength within her and a single keepsake, a silver buckle from Ethan's belt, the one he had worn on the day she first saw him. It gleamed faintly in the sun, a reminder of what had been, and of the strange unspoken bond that had defied both tribe and law. In time she reached the high plains, where the horizon stretched endless and blue. There she found her people, the remnants of her tribe, scattered and weary, living on the edge of the land that was once theirs. They watched her approach in silence, uncertain whether to fear or embrace her. She had been gone too long, changed too deeply, but when she told her story, their hearts softened. They listened to the tale of the white rancher who had spared her life, who had fought against his own kind to protect her, who had fallen beneath the sun beside the sacred creek. They heard not of betrayal but of courage, of two souls who had seen past blood and hatred to something purer, something the world itself could barely understand. Seasons turned. The years rolled by like dust on the wind. The war between settlers and tribes faded into the past, replaced by uneasy peace. Ranches grew, towns rose, and the land changed once again. But in the valley where Ethan Cole had fallen, the earth never forgot. Travelers passing through would sometimes speak of strange things, of a woman's figure seen at dusk by the creek, her long hair dark as midnight, her eyes reflecting the dying light of the sun. Some said she was a spirit, forever watching over the grave of the man who had loved her. Others claimed the sound of her song could be heard in the wind that passed through the cottonwoods, soft and sorrowful, like the voice of the earth itself mourning. Something lost. Years later, an old trapper stumbled upon the cairn by the creek. The stones were weathered but still carefully arranged. Beside it, a small charm of woven leather and silver hung from a branch, swaying gently in the breeze. When he touched it, the air grew colder, and for a brief moment he thought he heard a woman's whisper carried through the rustling leaves, a whisper that spoke of love, loss, and destiny. He told the tale in the saloons of nearby towns, and soon it spread far and wide. Ranch hands told it by their campfires. Drifters carried it from one frontier to the next, and before long, the valley gained a name: the Creek of the Apache Bride. They said no man who entered the valley with a cruel heart ever returned, but those who came with kindness in their soul found peace beneath its cottonwoods. And so, long after both the rancher and the Apache woman were gone, their story lived on, not written in books, but etched into the land itself. The wind carried their memory, the creeks sang their names, and the mountains held their silence. In a land that once knew only war and blood, their love, silent, forbidden, and unbroken, became a legend of the Wild West, a legend of two souls who met by a creek beneath the endless sky, and changed each other forever. Morning light crept slowly across the valley, painting the cliffs in hues of gold and crimson. The echoes of gunfire had long since faded, leaving behind a silence so deep it seemed sacred. Smoke drifted lazily in the air, rising from the burned remnants of brush and broken saddles. The land had gone still again, but it was not the stillness of peace. It was the stillness that comes after loss. For a time the world seemed to hold its breath. When the soldiers finally rode away, they left behind more than footprints and ashes. They left behind a story, one that the wind would carry, whispered across the canyons for years to come. In the center of the clearing lay Ethan Cole, the rancher who had defied both law and fear for something he barely understood but could never deny. His rifle was still in his grasp, the barrel cool now, and his hat had fallen to the dust beside him. But death had not claimed him fully. His breath still came, shallow and broken. The world swayed in and out of shadow. Through the haze he felt the faint touch of cool fingers against his brow. When his eyes fluttered open, he saw her, the Apache woman, kneeling beside him, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her long dark hair tangled with dust and blood. She had survived. Around them, the valley lay silent, but she was not alone. The earth seemed to move with her. The whispering grass, the trembling leaves, even the creek nearby, all seemed to echo her grief. Her gaze lingered on the rancher's face, seeing not the enemy her people had warned her about, but the man who had risked everything to give her a chance at life. She tore a strip from her blanket and pressed it against the wound on his side. There was no panic in her movement, only quiet determination. But in her heart she knew, some wounds could not be healed by hand or hope. Time blurred, the sun rose higher, and the air grew warm. The sounds of birds slowly returned, cautious at first, then steady. Ethan's breathing grew fainter. His eyes, once bright with resolve, now softened as they found her face again. Though no words passed between them, there was understanding, a silent farewell written in the space between their souls. She stayed with him until his breathing stopped. When the final sigh escaped his lips, she did not cry out. She simply closed his eyes and rested her hand upon his chest, feeling the last echo of his heartbeat fade beneath her palm. The world grew quiet once more. Then gently she rose. By the creek she gathered stones, smooth white ones shaped by water and time. One by one she placed them over his resting place, building a small cairn. The act was slow, deliberate, sacred. In her people's way it was a promise, that the spirit would not wander, that the soul would be remembered. The wind rose softly, carrying the scent of wild sage across the valley, as though blessing the ground where he lay. When the cairn was finished, she stood for a long time, gazing at the creek that had first bound their fates together. She could still see it clearly. That first morning when he had found her there, the fugitive bathing beneath the dawn light, her reflection rippling like a dream across the water. So much had changed since then. The man who once watched from the shadows now rested beneath this earth, and she, who had once run from all men, now carried his memory in her heart. She turned her face to the wind and began to walk. Days passed as she moved through the wilderness, crossing rivers, climbing canyons, following the silent paths known only to her people. She carried no weapon, no food, only the strength within her and a single keepsake, a silver buckle from Ethan's belt, the one he had worn on the day she first saw him. It gleamed faintly in the sun, a reminder of what had been, and of the strange unspoken bond that had defied both tribe and law. In time she reached the high plains, where the horizon stretched endless and blue. There she found her people, the remnants of her tribe, scattered and weary, living on the edge of the land that was once theirs. They watched her approach in silence, uncertain whether to fear or embrace her. She had been gone too long, changed too deeply, but when she told her story, their hearts softened. They listened to the tale of the white rancher who had spared her life, who had fought against his own kind to protect her, who had fallen beneath the sun beside the sacred creek. They heard not of betrayal but of courage, of two souls who had seen past blood and hatred to something pure, something the world itself could barely understand. Seasons turned. The years rolled by like dust on the wind. The war between settlers and tribes faded into the past, replaced by uneasy peace. Ranches grew, towns rose, and the land changed once again. But in the valley where Ethan Cole had fallen, the earth never forgot. Travelers passing through would sometimes speak of strange things, of a woman's figure seen at dusk by the creek, her long hair dark as midnight, her eyes reflecting the dying light of the sun. Some said she was a spirit, forever watching over the grave of the man who had loved her. Others claimed the sound of her song could be heard in the wind that passed through the cottonwoods, soft and sorrowful like the voice of the earth itself. Mourning something lost. Years later, an old trapper stumbled upon the cairn by the creek. The stones were weathered but still carefully arranged. Beside it, a small charm of woven leather and silver hung from a branch, swaying gently in the breeze. When he touched it, the air grew colder, and for a brief moment, he thought he heard a woman's whisper carried through the rustling leaves, a whisper that spoke of love, loss, and destiny. He told the tale in the saloons of nearby towns, and soon it spread far and wide. Ranch hands told it by their campfires. Drifters carried it from one frontier to the next, and before long the valley gained a name, the Creek of the Apache Bride. They said no man who entered the valley with a cruel heart ever returned, but those who came with kindness in their soul found peace beneath its cottonwoods. And so, long after both the rancher and the Apache woman were gone, their story lived on, not written in books, but etched into the land itself. The wind carried their memory, the creek sang their names, and the mountains held their silence. In a land that once knew only war and blood, their love, silent, forbidden, and unbroken, became a legend of the Wild West, a legend of two souls who met by a creek beneath the endless sky, and changed each other forever.